But apart from that, I just want to say that let us be as open as possible. We are not going to mind even if you criticize what we have done, because it is purely an academic exercise, and what we are doing here is going to help the country, and therefore we should be as open as possible.
And my first comment is actually based on the comments that were made by Professor Lumumba. His analysis, which he did chapter by chapter, theme by theme, I said, but why is half of that stuff not in the report? Because you gave a good analysis on a lot of the things, that you are not finding in the report. And I think for me, beyond the facts that are captured by the report, that analysis is what actually enhances particularly the advocacy initiatives that will need to be done. And it creates an even better picture. I'll give one quick example that then stood out in my mind very explicitly, and which I actually had also noted. That, for instance, when we talk about women's participation in politics, Kenya is dismally lagging behind in this particular region. And that doesn't pop out, but in your analysis, you really brought it out. So I noticed that in a couple of the comments that you made, and I think it might be useful for that analysis to be integrated into the report. It will really enrich it beyond the effects that have been captured here. And then secondly, it's actually quite interesting to note that Kenya has ratified 15 of the policy frameworks that are covered by this analysis. However, that should not fool us to think Kenya is doing well, because Kenya has only ratified 21 out of the 42 instruments. So Kenya is still only at the 52% par, and I think that needs to pop out a little bit more than is reflected in the report. And then thirdly, I was fascinated, and maybe understandably so, by the fact that the Constitution practically covers a lot, and this report has done a good job of showing us how the Constitution covers a lot of the articles that are actually being pushed for by the protocols. But I actually ended up realizing that this can end up making us get comforted and think these things are provided for us because the Constitution covers us. But we know that we do not operate directly from the Constitution. It's the legislation and the policy frameworks that are adopted by governments that are actually implemented. And for me, what I felt was missing from the report from each of the chapters was the reference of the specific legislation that has been enacted to implement and operationalize and harmonize and ensure. Because when we are implementing, we don't go to the Constitution, we go to the law, we go to the policy frameworks. In some instances, it comes out. There's some legislation that have been shown that show how that particular issue is being addressed. But there's a greater emphasis on the Constitution. And if you read this report, you say, Kenya is fine. But what we saw happen this year, for instance, on the two-thirds gender parity thing in Parliament shows you that you can't relax with the Constitution. Because the Constitution says no more than one gender should be, less than 1/3. But we saw that what has been done in terms of operationalizing that is not necessarily addressed in the quotas that you see. So I think that's one thing. And then the other issue that I felt was not coming out as clearly in all the chapters, it's there in some, it's not there in some, is the issue of linking the current context, the current issues, the current state to the AU instruments and to the things that we seek addressed. So for instance, when you read the chapter on youth, I'm using that as an example, I read and see what the AU instrument is saying. I see about the youth policy, I see about the youth council, but I'm not getting what is the state of youth in Kenya. And I'm not necessarily saying that should be elaborate. But for each of the sections, for me, it would be useful. And I'm a foreigner, so maybe that's why it came out much more even for me. I don't know quite well what is the state of youth in Kenya. You talked about the youth pouch, but I don't understand from this data. So what are we talking about when we say youth in Kenya, what percentage to the population, you know, how many of them are being affected by the different things that have been discussed here. So it might be useful just to have a little paragraph that introduces the context and the issues, so that when you elaborate, I then can see why. The other good one I can use as an example where it stood out for me was simply agriculture. When I read that, it talks about CADEM, it talks about what Kenya is doing in terms of contributing towards agriculture, in terms of what is allocated in the budget. But I don't know, is Kenya agriculture really that important to Kenya? Maybe not. But, you know, from, of course, practice and understanding the context of the country and the continent, I know it is, but I don't know what is agriculture currently contributing to the GDP. How many of the population depend on agriculture for their livelihood, da, 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 da. So why would it be important for Kenya to actually invest the 10% that has been articulated, and so forth and so on? So I think that's what I mean in terms of linking the issues to the, and then second to last, is I asked myself this question: how serious is Kenya about the African Union and the decisions that come from there? I say this because one of the things I think is fascinating in this region of the East Africa community is you have ministries of East Africa community that are dedicated purely to ensure that decisions that are coming out of the East Africa community are implemented within the countries and the harmonization processes go on. But I don't know if there's a similar structure that dedicates itself to the other regional bodies that Kenya is part of. You're part of ICAD, you're part of the AU, I think you're also part of COMESA, I don't remember. And so that's what I asked myself, how serious? And then I think that would be nice to put it there somewhere, to emphasize a lot of the findings that you have put here. And then lastly for me, chapter 8 I actually think is the most important chapter. But I found that it really hasn't been paid a lot of attention. Chapter 8 for me is the chapter that says, now that we've analyzed all these things, this is what we are saying. These are the key issues. These are the key problems. This is why Kenya, the gap between reality and the promise of these instruments exists. That analysis is completely not there. And that's for me where the key recommendations that are emerging from this analysis, and there are many, because as you were going along, I was actually, tabulating them. There are many, that's where they ought to come out. That's where, when we say we've read all this, we've read about all this data and da. These are the things you're actually saying to us. This chapter really, I think, wasn't paid the attention it should have been paid. This is the most important chapter for me in terms of the report.
I just have one short general observation in terms of actions required by civil society organizations. I feel that there's, for example, for the health and health strategy and HIV, it says engage in extensive education in grassroots areas using blah blah blah. I think it's assuming the recommendation is assuming all the work that is already being done, and I don't know how that recommendation can capture what is being done, so that when the action is so that the action that is taken is informed by what is already going on. I don't know if I'm making sense. And I've seen that also in chapter 5.
For our own record. You're thinking, for example, in the area of malaria, there is what one may call civil society involvement or non-governmental, like the AFIA program, the Food Zone program, the Ministry of Health, and all those. That those ought to be recognized as existing.
Yes.
Yeah, there was a mention about the 2010 SOTU Kenya report, which observed that which page 9? So there was a recommendation that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs needs to establish a link providing the instruments and the progress that Kenya is making to application. But my observation is that I don't know whether it was my omission why we didn't invest in interview one of the departments in the Foreign Affairs Ministry, activities and perhaps to give us a perspective on why is it a challenge for this to be created among many other challenges that were pointed in this report. So I guess we won't be able to target because some of the interviewees were government officials, but perhaps we looked at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and we could have gained a lot of information about it. My other observation on the same page is the last action, number 4, and I was wondering whether we had some time to review the APRM report, the last one that was done for Kenya, and specify the plan of action, and whether the government has made any effort towards the recommendations that they were given, but also the action that they committed to undertake. I think my other observation is to cover.
And I've seen there's been a great progress in interviewing key informant for this particular report. But one thing that came out in that Addis Ababa meeting is the absence of the voice of the wananchi on the street. And it was explained that maybe in terms of the methodology, that might have been a constraint. But from that particular meeting, we got offers from other organizations that have done surveys. Primarily, the Afrobarometer. They've been quite active in Kenya, and they have particular good data that has been picked from the citizens. Maybe it's to use those reports and the data that is available. Afrobarometer is just one of them, but if you look at the chapter on health, for example, here, you might find that it goes to maybe 8 pages and things like that, or the one on agriculture. Yet Kenya has such vibrant civil society that have done quite extensive databases around that. So I think it's to encourage the national researchers to feel at liberty to where those databases are there, to borrow from that to include that. That came out as a particular need for the people. My other things, and they're quite simple, is, for example, dating the treaties that we're addressing. If you notice, like the one for natural resources, there have been additional protocols and things like that, and it's nice to know which one you're talking about. And when we say Kenya has ratified, and if you address it that way, it would be nice for us to know when it ratified that, so that when we are measuring the implementation, we are able to see maybe this was only ratified 2 years ago, or it's been 10 years, so greater implementation should have been done. So I think that would help. I think also borrowing from something that Jana has said, and something that has been emerging in most of the supranational forums, is the national tendencies for governments to claim that they have more progressive municipal legislations. And as Jana was saying, people might tend to be comfortable with that. But I think we need to beef up the argument in a report like this, that progressive municipal law is great, but there is a need to create an outlet or an inlet for peer review, where they sign that it shouldn't be an excuse for not signing or ratifying international treaties. And I think for a country like Kenya, we've seen how useful that is. After the post-election violence, people require a particular framework to engage, and we saw the AU coming in. So if they are to sign the African Charter on Democracy, Elections and Governance, then those international bodies have a greater framework to engage. So I think that argument should be made. The other one was just a clarification on the VNCC, the Voluntary Waste Organization. I think the data there was good. It's just that I wondered why it is in the chapter on the welfare of the child, unless the data was suggesting that these were males under the age of 18. Maybe as you look, maybe it is where it was placed. I was just a bit not sure. Then the youth, I have a particular interest with the youth. So, and Kenyans have taken to saying that we now have a particular focus on the youth. Great. The Jubilee, and this is politics now, and the Jubilee government went on a youth platform and things like that. We sat back as the ministers, cabinet secretaries as they are now called, were being appointed. I'm not certain anybody in there meets the youth framework. The PSS, what are they now being called? Principal secretaries are going through the nomination, and probably they may all pass. I'm still not certain anybody there can qualify to be a youth. So in terms of reality of the promises and things like that, the same thing as that 1/3 gender, I'm wondering whether the reality on the ground really meets the expectations and the claims. So that sort of some nuanced analysis around that, because it's a reality that we see and we're living with.
Yes, I agree with everyone else. It's a very nice report, and I hope it's adopted once it's launched. I was concentrating on the area of the welfare and rights of women in Africa, and one thing that struck me is the elimination of harmful practices, especially the FGMs. And you'll notice that there's like a one sort of prescription to FGM, which is elimination of practices by instituting policies and coming up with these bills, like what Kenya tried to do when you go arresting parents who left their daughters out of school, and if their daughters are caught, or if they are caught practicing FGM, the parents were arrested and the mandates were given to the chief, and I don't think it really worked, because FGM is not just, for them, there are a lot of cultural issues involved that talk to the sense of the people in that particular community. So perhaps to be included in context, or something for us to think about, is some of the ways some of these women, especially in these communities, are sort of like circumventing what we're talking about, elimination of FGM, and just coming up with other measures. I wouldn't say hoodwinking, but trying to...
Are you talking about alternative passage rights as practiced amongst now?
And I think, yes,
So
and I think that's very important to capture, because I don't think FGM is something that we are going to eliminate anytime soon. And when we say, like the report mentions, some women allow this to thrive, may not necessarily be true, because there's all other issues, especially facing ostracization and victimization from your husbands, from all your relatives, and really with no other place to go. Most of them are left as victims, and really there are no other measures or other avenues that they can actually consider. So I think we should also capture those other aspects, like you mentioned, Professor Munga, about other passage rights that they're trying to now initiate in their communities and telling them this is the way it can be, and look at the way young women and girls in this particular community will thrive if certain aspects of, especially FGM, this is what happens when we are FGM free. So perhaps this is something that we ought to think about capturing. And one of the ways of dealing with FGM, instead of coming out and saying bills and arresting and giving powers to community chiefs and elders, who probably have no particular sense of ownership or commitment to the community. They just want to what do you say? Commander amesema, so let's just go ahead and do what we've been instructed to do, as opposed to joining with the community and telling them, okay, fine, I'm in agreement with this. How about coming together and saying, these other rights of passage, because many in the community listen to this, the administrations, the chiefs, and when they have those baradas. So when they say something, this is something that can be adopted. But anyway, I was just thinking about that, and I thought that particular thing is something that perhaps we can mention as a bit of a success. As opposed to just keeping on saying anti-FGM laws. And I think we'll be talking about anti-FGM laws until the cows come on. So perhaps that's just something.
The recommendations to government and to civil society. For me, more to government. When we say government, it means everything and nothing. Who exactly in government should be responsible, so that we're not just making a blanket document that says to government. Particularly for Kenya, I think it's important because Kenya has ratified most of these instruments. So who is absolutely responsible for pushing it and making it happen? And I think if we maybe elaborated, become a little bit more specific, which ministry or which department or whatever, it would be very useful. If it's not clear, that will also make it useful. Because I know in other countries, they're struggling with knowing who is responsible for pushing a particular bill so that it's implemented. They don't know. They know they can't ratify, but it's not clear who's responsible. I'm hoping that's not the case in Kenya, but if that's the case, then we know, so that we then can challenge, that clarity to happen. And where it's clear, let's say it specifically, so that for advocacy purposes, we can actually then go engage the relevant ministry or the relevant.
Health and reproductive rights.
been mentioned that the data of 2009 indicated that 91.5% of women aged between 15 to 49 attended antenatal care, and then the drastic drop in the same year it went down to 47.1. So I'm wondering whether for any age 39 under the health and reproductive rights, I'm wondering whether what was attributed to this significant drop. Could it have been probably due to things like premature birth, stillbirths? Did some of these women try to procure abortions that were carried out by quacks and died during the process? It will be interesting to find out why in the same year there was such a drastic drop from 91.5 to 47.1. And I highly doubt that having skilled attendants would be the only solution. Because then, depending on what reasons were given for the drastic drop, then we can begin addressing what are some of the solutions that could be addressed. What are some of the things that need to be done? For example, making a prenatal care for women, for pregnant women, accessible, especially at the grassroots level. Community sensitization programs and how they trickle down to the local wananchi. And what are the laws regarding the termination of unwanted pregnancies, then to reduce the chances that some of these women will run for the quacks who probably carry out what are the laws regarding the termination of
But the question would be, how do you transform an academic paper to a practical paper? The recommendations you give are not a little bit strategic. And that would mean, for instance, if you say there is 10% allocation to agriculture, if you check on the budget approved over the years, they keep increasing. But if you compare with the actual expenditures, there's quite a gap and it keeps getting bigger and bigger. So possibly it'll be easy, it'll be better for the, I believe all the participants here are towards the human rights, respect, and possibly for you to make it count by seeing that our missions and visions are really checked into, possibly try give strategic measures from academia to practice.
Which page?
Okay, for instance, you say the agriculture should be, supposed to be at a allocation of 10%, but it's 5% over years. But if you check the budgets and the actual expenditures, they do not rhyme. If you check on the recommendations you've given on agriculture itself, just a minute. The government needs to fast track the approval of the new mining bill. Fine, it may be fast tracked, but how do you ensure that that is put in practice and is reaching the effect is reaching the people at the grassroots?
Let me hear you. I hear you say that, first of all, remember that this is an attempt to audit the compliance with the implementation protocol. So there is a level at which this is a very practical exercise, because we want to ensure that what is promised in the Constitution and in legislation is actually being effected on the ground. What I hear you say, so that we capture it correctly, is that you'd want to see something that talks about the gap between what is on paper and what is on the ground. That is what you want us to say something about?
What I'm hearing is that you have budget allocations,
Yes.
but expenditure
Okay.
itself seems to be even less than the budget allocation. So the discrepancy is probably even higher than we are anticipating. The target might be 10%. The budget allocation might be 4.8% as the document says. But the expenditure is even less than what has been budgeted. So it means the gap is significantly higher than what is indicated by looking at the budget allocation. That's what I would say.
Okay.
Thank you.
Just to add to that, I think there's also an opportunity there. Just looking at some of those figures, and I think this is something that recurs in Kenya, maybe it's a good opportunity to pin it down. The gap between, as you were saying, the approved budgets and the actual expenditures. If you look at, and this is a good way you distinguish the recurrent from the development expenditure. And the trend from just looking at this is the recurrent expenditure, the allocation matches the expenditure. But when you come to the development, there seems to be a gap. So we are absorbing the recurrent expenditure. We have no problem with that absorption, but we have a problem with the development.
Please kindly refer to the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, Article 14.2c on reducing maternal mortality and morbidity in Africa. It may give some clue into the health and reproductive rights of women. Yes.
You said 14C.
14.2c.
14.2c.
Yes.
That couple of pages is actually a very nice analysis that might be better belong in the conclusion, because it's an analysis of the situation for Kenya based on the devolved governance system that has now been adopted and how it affects implementation of these policies. So I think that write-up is a very good analysis, but probably will get lost where it is, because that bit seems to be talking just about Kenya. But this is a very good analysis that talks about the challenges that are specific for Kenya regarding implementation of international treaties, which have now been delegated to the county systems and so forth and so on. That's what I think on that one. And then on chapter 1, the study under background is not going to focus on Egypt, yeah? So I think Egypt needs to be removed from there, from my understanding, and Malawi. And then under page 8, the status of popularization and ratification of AU protocols. It says out of the 43 AU instruments, there are 42. I know we tend to refer to CADEP as an instrument, but CADEP is a framework. And if you not, even the instruments that this study is looking at, only 10 of those are protocols, charters, and the others are frameworks, are policy frameworks. So just to make that distinction. And then the following paragraph on that, but this might just go back into editing. There is an I interviewed. Of course, at this level now, we are no longer, it's not the researcher who interviewed, they are producing now a report on behalf of SOTU. Those were my quick points there.
Where is that again?
Page 8.
Paragraph?
The last paragraph, the first sentence ends with before people that I interviewed.
Okay.
And then I have the recommendation on actions required by civil society organizations. I think they have a responsibility to monitor implementation as well. And it could be done in a clever way. Different organizations that focus on different sectors or issues can pick the instrument that's relevant to them. So if I work for a women's rights organization, we then adopt the women's protocol and monitor it. And if I work on judicial issues, we pick up on corruption and so forth and so on. The redistribution and ownership of land, all those things are sort of picked in the last 2 years. Again, when I read this, it looks like things are so nice and sweet.
Question
in Kenya. Yeah.
Dr. Godwin was talking about that's a huge complaint that we cannot, instead we just mention it in passing because we cannot do justice by bringing it up. It will leave more questions than answers. And I think the current project, Fahamu is undertaking the right reforms that has been issued out. So he said, okay, find a footnote on TJRC reports and things like that for those who may be interested because of the, depth. of the situation.
Agreed, but you don't get it at all.
Okay.
Even if you were to put, you'd rather have a sentence or two and put your footnotes. Because when you read the report itself, if you do not live in this country, or you're not Kenyan, I guess, you do not know, honestly, from this report. That's just the point I'm making. And then I also, as I was reading, particularly the bit under the African Convention and Conservation of Nature and Natural Resources, and on the issues around land, I realized myself what are the practical bottlenecks that are challenging. Because the more they are exposed, the easier it is to know what actions you're going to need to take. And then my last one is under the actions required by the government. There's no recommendation whatsoever on CADEP, yet you have already pointed out that there is a challenge in terms of what is being allocated. Isn't it we're pushing for the fact that government needs to meet its commitments? So I think there needs to be a recommendation regarding that. And I guess the point that also came out based on their point around analyzing the gap between allocation and implementation, we might want to refine.
Related to what Jana was saying about CADEP and government commitments, and also this appears in chapter 4 as well. So over and above increasing the allocation to the commitments, to the 15% in the case of health and 10% on land, I would suggest also that a recommendation be made on tackling the corruption and inefficiencies that already exist. For example, Professor had mentioned NHIF and the resistance for the rising of the fees, and this was because of it was perceived to be corrupt and inefficient. So probably increasing is good, but also the money that is already there, or the allocation that is already there, should also be effectively used.
Okay. Which chapter are you on?
No, both chapter 4 and
perhaps this is just me and
a few others, but on the recommendation on microfinance as a solution to women, to liberating women from economic oppression. Studies have been done, and a lot of some people have written that this actually is there's a question mark on whether microfinance actually works. So I would say it's not very comfortable having it as a main action that I don't.
You're being shy about it. I think you are right.
Yeah.
That perhaps is something that we need to reinterrogate, even in the question of youth. These assumptions that every youth can engage in business is actually misguided. So I think I hear you saying that even as we make that recommendation, we ought to have a caveat. That this may not very well be the silver bullet, as it were.
And I think on youth, actually, there's a whole spectrum of recommendation. On the chapter on youth, there's a lot more than just entrepreneurship as a solution to.
Any specific recommendation?
Yeah, because on women it says on youth it says inclusion of young women in decision making, encouraging youth involvement in agricultural sector. I think this is more captures the entire spectrum of empowering youth in this case, and probably women, than just microfinances.
So that I don't lose example, the problem that is mentioned regarding microfinance is quite true. That over time, particularly the last decade, microfinances have moved from being developmentalistic in mind to being commercial.
Yeah.
So that you walk into any microfinance right now, you want a loan, and most likely that the interest rate is much higher than even the commercial ones themselves. While anecdotal evidence point that they help. When we had evidence point others, you've heard of people committing suicide because they cannot be able to pay their loans. You've heard of youth fund reporting 97% repayment capacity or payment progress, whereas someone could have sold their intrinsic value, the assets that have intrinsic value, including cows, including house furniture, so that they can pay them. So in government development tables, that one is being reorganized. And right now, I don't want to preempt so much, but we are in the process of establishing an alternative institutional framework for giving access to affordable credit backed by government guarantees. Why? Because the poor have always been rated as bad risk, and so the banks have actually priced them away from accessing credit because of their stringent operational requirements. Now, what is this that we want to do? We want to establish community banks. Because actually 70% of deposits in microfinance are from the poor, yet they don't access the funds. So we want to establish community banks so that they can mobilize their own savings, they can establish their own associations so that they can lend themselves. And then the government puts in seed money in those community banks. So that could be a recommendation as well. But it's a strong institutional framework backed up by a legal framework also, so that it doesn't go the commercial way.
You said something which if you could just repeat about the department that has been created for this youth access to procurement. You said the department is called what?
Youth access to government procurement opportunities. I think it's not in the department, but you go to Treasury Room 403, I think that's where it is.
Very specific
program that will it also require an amendment to the Procurement Act?
It requires an amendment to the Procurement Act, requiring the setting up of a legal
Okay.
And it is in the treasury.
The treasury finance the former
treasury.
The national treasury.
So, did you say 70% come from the community or something?
I don't remember the actual study, but when we were trying to develop a community bank, we had to look at some of the literature available on the dynamics in the microfinance sector, and to realize that the deposits in the microfinance sector, 70% of the deposits come from those people who cannot probably not access because of operational requirements by banks. It's actually the poor who are contributing to deposits in microfinance. But when you go to ask for them,
yeah, I think on this debate, for me, the issue also goes back, I think this could be part of analysis, is our education systems do not focus on entrepreneurship, but we offer it as a solution to dealing with issues of unemployment, and then we create these funds, which of course end up being returned, as in the case for women in this instance. Because there's an assumption that because I don't have a job, I want to be an entrepreneur, and I may not be interested in it. I've not been trained and cultured in that. When you look at our subsistence agriculture, there's an assumption that or let them scale up to becoming commercial, but that yet we do not inculcate that in any developmental process or in any training. So it's really something I think is relevant to raise and tease out, even if there are those opportunities that are there. Are they the right opportunities?
really?
Yeah, just to build up on what Jana is saying, because you'll find that even those women who are encouraged to take these loans from these microfinance institutions and end up having these businesses, there's still no laws to protect them from Western interest, where you find that, they come up and have their corporate laws and, like what happened to a brand like Kikoi, just an example. So you have, people moving in from the West who have no interest and who know their rights in the law, and the women here who have started these initiatives are not protected. But perhaps as an action, one of the actions we can consider as a substitute to this accessing finance from these financial institutions is support those women-led projects. Because at the moment we have to accept that the education levels are not where they are, and these are not measures or solutions that will come overnight. So perhaps supporting these women-led projects that we have in the community, where these women more often than not do not need the money, but they need that capacity to enable them to actually earn that living on their own. There was this story that was carried some time back. It's somewhere in this island where these women were taken to somewhere in Asia to learn about, what was that? Was it a Jiko or I'll remember the story, sorry. But the point of the point of that particular exercise was equipping them with these particular skills where they do not need to go looking for finances, where they can be able to take ownership of their own projects and source from within. Because we've had all these horrible stories about microfinance institutions coming over to take your property, if you fail or upon failure to repay. So perhaps as a recommendation, it could be just supporting these women-led activities because they start at the grassroots and they should be owned, and the women should take that particular initiative there, as opposed to just coming and telling them, okay, microfinance is a solution. So just encouraging them and as part of their employment process.
I like the mention of a multi-sectoral approach, so that this task is not just left alone to the Ministry of Gender and all that. So I don't know how we can, probably that better communication between ministries that can be able to facilitate that promotion of women across all those departments.
I don't know, you from the government, part of the explanation for not having a ministry for youth and gender is that the government has taken the view that this is cross-cutting. Is there a document in terms of allocation of duties where the government says this, when in the 18-odd ministries? What is the kind of brief that has been circulated to the ministries, and could we access that copy where this is actually specified?
Okay, currently we have, I think the first circular for the new government, which is one government organization, where they specify which this ministry is under this office. And as you said, issues of youth are being mainstreamed in many of the ministries. But again, the president himself took upon himself to locate the former Ministry of Youth and the devolution plan. He himself wants to see to it that the objectives for the youth empowerment are met. So yes,
youth and women are in the president's office. Both.
There's a circular. Currently, there is also within the devolution plan. There's a retreat next to finalize on the organization of each and every directorate and department. We have these ministries, departments, and agencies. That's what they want to go and finalize, so that they allocate functional competencies to each and every directorate, harmonize it, and then now bring it into the public.
Is working for us.
So quickly on children and youth.
So just a quick one on the women one, as it tends to be children and youth. I think earlier Anna addressed the point of the contrasting to the region in terms of women's participation in politics. And then the second one for me in that chapter is when he's talking about access to justice, when they're talking about access to justice, I actually wondered if it might be important to also talk into the decision of the Constitutional Court regarding the issue of the 2/3, 1/3 thing, because I think it's pivotal. And for me, like I said earlier on, it shows me that I'm not comforted by the constitutional provisions, because if then the Supreme Court can come and say, oh, this is a gradual thing, you eventually get there. It means then I can't have those immediate benefits which we got excited by when the Constitution was passed this way.
I was interested in the child labor. Why don't we see how that will protect children from being exploited?
Why don't we?
Yes.
I wouldn't want to contradict them, but I was surprised and the representative from the Ministry of Education, unless specifically they said, which they did, but I think that needs to be explained, that you might not be able to locate an actual offense committed by the penal code. But child labor has, in my view, if my memory serves me well, has been criminalized in other legislations.
It is not in the penal code, it is in other legislation. And I think the Children's Act mentions that what cannot be done. And I think that is what we'll do. Of course, we heard you the first time, that there is need to expand on this so that it comes out clearly that the Children's Act criminalizes certain things and talks about age in the labor sector. That is in the labor law. But I hear you that it's important to bring it here, even if in a single sentence, so we make it clear.
And the question is, the basic education bill still a bill, or was it passed into a law? Or what's the status of that? Does it not? No? It's referred to under right to education on page 41.
In fact, even this, it's important just for information. In other countries, they don't actually call it free primary education. They say universal primary education rather than free.
Yeah.
Yeah. There is something that is very unique to Kenyan free. I think it's one of the bills that lapsed. That will confirm. I think it lapped during the last phase. It lapped to be introduced. Yes.
It's now announced.
The basic education. The basic. Okay. It's not announced. Okay.
This year?
Check.
2012. We check.
So I think we can get to the last few comments on youth.
Sorry, I think I'll talk in reference to in the view of this special education, which is really proud. It's lacking, it's wanting. Maybe can give us like a way forward, because this is tasked with the department to the Ministry of Education. Because with the free primary education, yes.
We're now changing our
universal. So I want to hear more about that, because when I went to the chief account office, that money, this money that they allocate to schools, they say that we're not even aware what happens, and then they just give. But then they focus on certain schools. But what happens, like in my region, when there's no special, where you're supposed to take your kids, and the teachers in those know they're trying to integrate. You don't even have the teachers for that. I don't know what's the way for an basis, how we approach it, because I just got.
And then on the same, I think we got, as in the presentation of we saw that at every chapter there was action by the government and action by the civil society. So some of here has to be included as well. And on tobacco, I was wondering if we could say something, page 49, something that would also target companies. Because I know in other countries where they have a number of legislations, they have in actions also targeted to companies that do that. And it's very, basically, every legislation that comes is fought by all the companies. They fight against it. That's why they come up with this social corporate responsibility scholarship program to appease the situation. But I think what action can be done to target companies the last 2 minutes we have.
I wanted to comment something on page 48, sustainable livelihoods and youth employment. Somewhat related to chapter 3 about agriculture. I sort of feel like agriculture has never been like an option which is viably pushed to the youth. Not necessarily pushed, rather it's not an option which has been freely given. Its viability hasn't been explored as far as the youth and its participation. Considering that we have all this crazy food insecurity and everything. As a young person, forgive the expression, but I feel that agriculture is less sexy these days. You rather want to go and do something IT, starts an SME, that kind of a thing in entrepreneurship. But I don't feel like the youth are being actively engaged in as far as agriculture and such things are concerned. Perhaps there should be work done in this regard.
On the rights of the child, I don't know, perhaps it's just me, but also like to see mention what the role of the children, the Department of Social Services of Children, and the Development Council, I don't even know or remember. And some obscure, I think they still have a role to play because in cases of adoption, for those parents who are seeking to adopt, or individuals seeking to adopt children, that is the particular, I wouldn't say ministry, but that's the particular department charged with that. And I have a couple of rather personal cases where I've heard from friends and even relatives who've tried to adopt that the children service, I don't even know what it's called. But normally they're usually involved, and their work, as you would expect, is to monitor and you as a new parent are qualified and just to take care of the child's rights, basically. You know, is this child going to a good home and all that in But you'll find that more often than not they frustrate your efforts. And they don't really look at the key, what you think would be the key requirements for you as an individual to adopt. But the process has been riddled with a lot of corruption. So, and I don't think many people know exactly what their role is, but I don't think you can attempt to go to court while you're seeking adoption without the involvement of this Department of Social Services for Children. So perhaps just as I mentioned, because I think they're still involved, and we see all these foreigners with adopting Kenyan children. I mean, how are they successful that you are not? And I know for those who have tried and have actually given up because of the frustration of being able to have. So perhaps just to mention what exactly the role of this particular department is towards the realization of children's rights.
Do I hear you saying that the wisdom mentioning something about both women and children in relation to trafficking? Just a sentence than what you are saying in terms of protection, because these are issues that just a sentence, even if it is not directly related, that you are protecting them against. For example, what is happening in adoptions? Actually, these adoption rings are actually trafficking rings.
Perhaps.
Be within our mandate, just a sentence or two.
Yeah.
Perhaps it could be dual, because I think it's very important for us to know what exactly this department does in terms of under the children's rights, but also as I mentioned, towards this adoption and all the rings of trafficking. So I don't know how it would be framed, but I think they deserve special mention.
Okay, so I think we can stop here. The last one, John?
Just taking you back to chapter 3, 9. In Kenya has which page? You captured the progress that Kenya has made in developing the youth mind. The last 2012 review that the progress report mentioned that Kenya has made these strides in development, whereby 35% local ownership. It's one of the leading examples in the continent. It seems to also be one of the design mentioned is one of the progress towards the localization of the ownership of this
On the broad recommendations, as we encourage deeper analysis, maybe is to anchor the reporting provisions within some or all the statutes. Because ratification, we've seen from practice that where countries are actually want to report, and they actually do report. It's a great way of putting pressure for them to implement. So if you're able to analyze and tease out the statutes and what the reporting mechanisms are, and whether actually Kenya has reported or it's already in that way, for us to come up with a recommendation on that.
Thank you very much. Before we close, anything from the Secretary?
No, ours is to thank you very much for taking the time from your extremely busy work. Thanks for supporting. We've had tremendously important things coming out from this meeting. This will not only be useful for our support for our Kenyan partners, but we're also doing this with the other organizations. So there are certain things that you say that we'll be able to share with the others. So thank you so very much. We totally appreciate it. Thanks, Fahamu. Congratulations for putting this together. And we look forward to seeing the product and the advocacy actually.
And comments from us?
Comments on, I think the research team has done a very good job, very commendable, because I think if we compare to the initial copy we have of 2010, is a lot more analysis, linking it to the local but also continental reach, what we are looking for. So we thank you very much for that. And to our colleagues and partners from the ministries of devolution, education, Equality Now, ICJ, SWAM, thank you very much for coming. And I think if you remember on your way out any comments or question, you can still email them, because we have enough time to incorporate all these comments and to enrich it. And you'll be hearing from us probably in the next 1 week for the proposed date for launching the report, probably in the next 3-4 weeks. So we would like all of you to support us again by coming, and as we asked Prof to have those specific detailed departments where to go for this, we make sure that all those departments are presented, so that we give to them, look at this page, your department is required to do A, B, C, D, and we do that. So in the next 3-4 weeks, we will launch it, having incorporated programs. I'm told we have, all of us are invited at Terrace Restaurant, which is downstairs at the lobby for lunch. Please come. Don't go before we have shared.
Free lunch or universal?
Universal lunch. Universal lunch. I
thought you were going to give us the opportunity also.
Yes. You want to say something?
Yes, I mean, we have to.
Okay.
No, just very briefly. First of all, unfortunately, I can't see everybody. But we thank you so much for giving us the opportunity to prepare the report. And the comments which have emerged from colleagues here are going to be very useful, at least in terms of improving, the report. You talked about emails. Hopefully, we'll get, the emails of everybody, so that at least you can communicate. And again, hopefully, they are going also to send more comments via email, which will also help us in terms of improving, the document. Yeah, but again, I'm sure you take cognizance with the fact that we reserve the right to integrate what we think is relevant. We'll do the best we can, but indeed, Fahamu must take that into cognizance, because we think that what we are going to do is not only going to be good for Fahamu, so that your image is also appreciated by whoever is reading the document, but also on our part as well. So we'll do the nuances as may be necessary. That's all I want to say.
Okay, thank you. So, that's the universal large terrace restaurant.